Today is the 7th of June 2017 and I'm Sharon Slater and I'm interviewing Matthew Potter on life in the Newtown, Clorina area and around the Shannon Estuary. So first, Matt, when did you move to Newtown?
I moved to Newtown in 1974. My father was from Newtown, but he had lived in Donegal for 40 years, 1934 to 1974. But my mother was also from Limerick. She was from Mungret, and they always wanted to return to live in Newtown. So in 1974 they managed to do so. So 1974, 25th of September to be precise. And I lived in Newtown then for 14 years till 1988 when I got married and moved into Limerick City.
So your grandparents lived in the Newtown and Mungret area?
Not only my grandparents, the Potters have been living in Newtown since at least 1801. I say at least because the records don't go back any further than 1801. So my grandfather, my father was born in Newtown, John Potter. My grandfather lived in Newtown, although he was born in Donegal. My great-grandfather, John Potter, also was from Newtown, and his father before him then, whose name escapes me now, Garrett Potter, sorry. Garrett Potter was born in Newtown in 1807, and his father before him then was, his name escapes me. But so that's the number of generations then. You're talking about, 6 generations? 7, you can count them out anyway. Myself, my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, then you have Garrett, and then you have the man. Yeah, so 6 I'd be the 6th generation of Potter living in Newtown. My brother, of course, still lives there.
And what were their occupations in Newtown?
You mean the Potters or people
Potters,
in general?
yeah.
Potters were small farmers. The landowner in Newtown, traditionally it was a family called Tuthill, Tuthill, and they lived in Faha, which is in Clorina area as well. But then in 1859 the last of the Tuthills died out, and the estate then passed to the Taylors, who lived in Pallaskenry. So the Taylors were the landlords then of the area of Newtown until the beginning of the 20th century, then when all the tenants bought out their land. So the Potters would have been, as I say, tenants of the Tuthills and then of the Taylors. Their farm was comparatively small. I think it was around 13, 15 acres or something like that. It wasn't until my uncles inherited it from my grandfather in 1959 that they began to expand it then greatly in the 60s and into the 70s. But of course this was typical of people in Newtown. A great many of them would have been small farmers or farm labourers.
And the house that they lived in, what kind of a house was that?
Well, the Potters lived in a small thatched house until the early 1970s. I can barely remember being in it now, around 1971, but so far as I can remember it was 1 story, and it definitely had a kitchen, and it had a number of bedrooms, I would imagine. It would have been quite small, but then it was in an advanced state of decay in the early 70s, and my 2 uncles then, these were my father's 2 brothers, they never married. They built a new house then, adjoining the old one, in the early 1970s. I think it was built around 1973-74, that period. And my 2 uncles lived there then with my grandmother until 1980. She died then. And then my 2 uncles continued to live there in this particular house until their own deaths in 2013 and 2016, respectively.
And your neighbours, when you moved back to Newtown, what were their names and what were their occupations?
There was two houses adjoining us. One was a man called Tommy Clark and his wife Breda. Tommy Clark was an electrician. He worked with the ESB. He was from County Meath, but his wife was from Clorina. And then the adjoining house then to him again was a man called Jimmy Collins, and he worked in the cement factory, which was the major employer in the area. That's something that I could expand on at some length, because when Cement Limited opened in 1938, it really transformed the whole area. Up to that, you had the 2 major occupational groups that I already referred to, I think, briefly. You had the farmers, and then you had the farm labourers who worked for the bigger farmers. So a lot of the farmers were small farmers. They didn't make a lot of money. and the labourers were badly paid. There was only a minority of large farmers, but Cement Limited provided a lot of well-paid employment, and it really transformed the area in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. When I came to live in Newtown in 1974, a great many of my neighbours were working in the cement factory, and they had very good pay, and conditions were quite good. And I can remember a sort of hearing, it was quite, looking back now, to be sort of quite quaint, but one of the signs of this affluence, in addition obviously to the fact that they were able to, refurbish their houses and buy cars and stuff, but a lot of them had caravans in Ballybunion, and this of course at the time was regarded as the height of affluence. So another neighbour of mine then would have been, there was a big farmer then called Matt Murphy, and then I'm just thinking of, on our particular road, there was actually only my uncles at the very end of the road, Matt Murphy the farmer, myself and my family, the two others I mentioned, Tommy Clark, Jimmy Collins. Then there was a small farmer called Willie McGregor, and then you went up the road for a considerable distance. There were no houses, and then you had an elderly female farmer called Delia Purcell. But you see, in Newtown there are two roads, as you probably know from your visits there now. You have the hill road, which goes up about the top of the crest of the hill and down the other side, and then you have the line road, which goes around the side of the hill. That's where I lived. There were very few houses on the line road, whereas the hill road had quite a few houses. Now when you go to the end of the hill road, where it joins with the line road again, of course, you continue on down in towards the bottom of Newtown. If you go on straight, you come to Churchfield, which is where a very wealthy farmer called Donny O'Brien, Corey O'Brien lived. In more recent times, his relative Donny O'Brien lived there. He was a nephew of some description, I think. And now I think Donny O'Brien is deceased, so now I think it's his son Conor O'Brien is there, whom you interviewed already, I think. And if you then take the left, instead of going straight onto Churchfield, you take a left, and it brings you down to quite a lot of houses in Newtown. And down at the very end of that road, then there's a kind of a cluster of houses. It used to be called Carryclutter, not a separate townland, but quite heavily populated down there. And again, you'd have there was fairly. Let me see now. Again, there would have been a couple of well-to-do farmers down there, and there would have been then a number of people working in Cement Limited. So I suppose agriculture and the Cement Limited, they were the two main employers in Newtown. But long before I came to live there, and for long afterwards as well. But the cement factory now, of course, the numbers employed there have declined very, very sharply. So it's no longer a major employer. It employs about, at its height, when I came to live in Newtown in 1974, it employed 500. Now I understand it employs about 40 full-time staff and about 40 then who come in on contracts.
And the houses on both of those roads, how many of them were thatched?
1974, when I came to live in Newtown, I don't think there were any of them at all thatched. There would have been a lot of labourers' cottages, of course, that were built in the 19th century. They would have been built by the Board of Guardians, and then later on they were built by the Board of Health, and then from 1942 onwards were built by the County Council. So, for example, my family and I lived in a labourer's cottage in the 1930s. Then Tommy Clark next door lived in a labourer's cottage, which was from the time of De Valera's cottage, we'll say, such as the 1880s, 1890s, and the Jimmy Collins the same. So that was 3 labourers' cottages side by side. And then the farmer, of course, Matt Murphy, he lived in a fairly large farmhouse. The other farmer then, Willie McGregor, he lived in a small farmhouse, similar to what my uncles lived in. And then Miss Delia Purcell, she built a bungalow at one stage, but I think she was in a small little house as well. In the Hill Road then, you had a variety of houses. There was a few new bungalows, of course, at that stage as well in the 1970s. But they proliferated then, of course, in succeeding decades. There's a lot more new houses now in Newtown. I mean, I don't know what the population of Newtown is now compared to what it was in 1974, but there are obviously a lot more people living there now, a lot more houses. But my uncle's old house that they moved out of in the early 70s, that was thatched, as far as I can remember. It was, I think, yeah. And there was a house then in another part of Clorina, in Carrick, near Carrigunel Castle. That was, and still is, thatched. But thatched houses would have been very, very rare in the 1970s in Newtown and in the whole area, in fact.
And did you know any of the fishermen in the area when you were growing up?
I did. I knew people like Liam Coughlin and Peter Burns, and strangely enough, I was very unaware of the fishing industry in Newtown. I knew people went fishing, but I think my father didn't fish, and none of my immediate family did. My uncles didn't. So I thought it was more or less a sort of a hobby. I didn't realise it was actually a fairly important part of the local economy, that farmers, farm labour, well, not so much the big farmers, but the smaller farmers, and particularly the farm labourers, and then of course then later on a lot of the farm labourers became factory workers in Cement Limited. They would have fished along with their other jobs, so it was actually quite an important part of their income. And but I understand, I only discovered this in recent years, that my grand-uncle was actually a fisherman. His name was Mick Bryn, Michael Bryn. He would have been my grandmother's brother, because my grandfather obviously was potter, but my grandmother on my father's side, my father's mother, was Bryn, was her surname, Brinn, and her brother was Mick Bryn, and he lived in the house, by the way, that we subsequently moved into in 1974, and his main job, I think, was he was a sort of a farm labourer, but he also fished. So I'd say that was a common enough pattern, I would imagine. Farm labourer plus fisherman, small farmer plus fisherman, cement factory worker plus fisherman. Fishing, as far as I know, I don't think there was any such thing as a full-time fisherman like you'd have in a place like Killybegs or something. It was supplementary to their income. But it was an important part of their income, of course, you know.
And was there a small primary school in the area?
Yes. There were two of them, actually. They'd been built by William Monsell of Turvoo, and they were still there in the 1970s. One of them was for the boys and one of them was for the girls, and they were in close proximity to each other. They'd been built in the 1850s, I think. I didn't go to them myself because I was 16 when I came to live in Limerick. My brother did briefly, though, and they were replaced in 1976 by the modern primary school, Ballybrown School, which adjoins Ballybrown Church, and that was opened in 1976. So that was a big change from these two little old schools that were, completely old-fashioned, and I understand they were quite cold, and sanitary facilities weren't particularly good, and they were too small. So these were replaced then by this new primary school. There was another little old primary school up in Lurga, up at the other end of the parish, and it was replaced as well by this Ballybrown School.
And same with church facilities. What were the...
The church is the same one that's still there, Ballybrown Church. Newtown and Clorina are actually Newtown, of course, is a townland in Clorina, but Clorina is only half a parish. The parish is actually Patrick's Well and Ballybrown, and which is ironic from the point of view of the hurling fraternity, because, of course, Ballybrown and Patrick's Well are two bitter rivals on the field of hurling, but they're actually at either end of the one parish, Ballybrown in the north and Patrick's Well in the south. So in the parish, when I came to live in it, you had two churches. You had Ballybrown Church, which catered for the Ballybrown side, and then you had a little small church up in Patrick's Well called Lurga Church. And it was replaced then around 1977 or 8, much the same time as the school, by a modern church in Patrick's Well. And those are still the two churches in the area. Now, there was a significant minority of Protestants in the area, Church of Ireland for the most part. The Church of Ireland church, though, in the area had closed many, or at least, I'm not sure when it closed, but it was definitely closed by the time I arrived anyway, in 1974. I think it closed in the 60s. I could check that. But in those days, of course, everybody in the area went to Mass. And not only was Mass going important from the religious point of view, but it was a great social event as well. Now, my parents didn't particularly like Ballybrown Church, so when I got my first car in 1980, we started going to Mass in town, and we hardly ever went to Ballybrown afterwards. But that's the church that's still there. It was built in the 1830s. And as I say, the church patched well then in the 1970s.
And the GAA was an important part
Oh,
of the
yes,
community.
yes. It was the major, and still remains the major focal point in the whole area. I didn't play myself and had little or no interest in it. Neither did my brother. My uncles, I believe, were interested. I discovered that in more recent years. But in general, just about everyone in Newtown and in the whole area was involved to some extent in Ballybound GAA, which had been established, depending on your point of view. I think it claims to have been established in 1890, but I think it sort of came and went over the years. But it was very important in the area and remains very important. And I suppose you could say Newtown and Clorina were a typical rural Irish area of the period, in that the main focuses of identity would have been the Catholic Church, the GAA, and of course politics would have been in part as well. I mean, Newtown and Clorina would generally be considered an area that was very stronghold of the Fianna Fáil party. And again, it was very interesting from a sociological point of view. You could actually measure the support for Fine Gael in many instances by the size of the farmers. The big farmers were Fine Gael. And of course, there was a sprinkling of other people as well, whereas the smaller farmers and the labourers stroke factory workers would have been Fianna Fáil. And so a lot of people would say there was a kind of a triumvirate, really, the church, Catholic Church, GAA, Fianna Fáil. They were kind of, and many people in the area were members of and supporters of all three.
What other amenities were in the area?
Well, you would have had a soccer club in the area, which again I wasn't involved in. It still exists, of course, called Bresca Rovers. I think it was established in the 1970s, and the pubs were very important. Now, there was no pub actually in Newtown at all, but the locals who went to pubs, they would have gone to two locations. There are the two pubs back in the Ferry Bridge. There's Curran's on the Clorina side of the Ferry Bridge, and the Bucket on the Kildimo side of the Ferry Bridge, and those two still exist. But strange enough, in Mungret then, where the other location for the pubs that were patronised locally, there were two pubs in Mungret as well, namely the Westward Ho and Shanahan's. Both of them now are closed, which is an interesting comment on the times. And of course then the GAA club, of course, also had a bar, still has a bar. I suspect, and I'm not, of course, I haven't lived in the area now for nearly 30 years, but I suspect now the GAA club has become more important because the two pubs in Mungret have closed down. And then, of course, there was Macra na Firma, which that was something I was heavily involved in. That was, I suppose you could call it a youth club for people living in rural areas. And the name, of course, Macra na Firma, means sons, of course, and presumably daughters as well of the farm. But in the 1980s, Ballybound Macra na Firma, it had been established in 1949, and it actually folds up in 1999, just after its 50th anniversary, strangely enough. But it was very, very popular in the 70s, but I didn't get involved in the 80s and into the 80s, and then it began to decline in the 1990s. I liked Macra because I wasn't into sport, but it provided a number of other activities, such as quizzes and drama and variety shows and debating. And of course then they had dances and discos and all that kind of stuff. So it was great, really, you know. And it was the main means by which I got to know my neighbours then. We'd come to Newtown when I was 16, and then I'd gone to school in the Crescent. I hadn't gone to primary school. And then because I wasn't involved in any sports in the area, I was at a bit of a loss then until I got involved in the Macra na Firma, and then I got to know a load of people with whom I'm still friendly.
And what was the main form of transport?
Motor cars. There was and remains a very poor bus service. I don't know whether it's worse or better now than it was when I was living there. I imagine it's probably worse. It was quite poor. Now, to be fair, I mean, it's hard to provide a bus service into every nook and cranny in County Limerick or in rural Ireland in general. So, for example, when I was going to school, I used to have to get a bus at Turvoo, which is about a mile and a half from where I lived. It's where Hayes' shop is. And then I used to have to get off the bus at Turvu, I think, and get another bus in Clorina. And that brought me in then to town. I was going to the Crescent Comprehensive. But because the bus service was quite poor, everybody had a car. Now, a few people didn't have cars. My father never drove a car. But without a car, it was almost impossible to get anywhere. So when I bought my first car in 1980, it was a transformative moment for me and my family. We were able to go all sorts of places, then in and out of town, no bother. I was able to get in and out to work. Actually, before I got the car, I had started work for Limerick Corporation in 1978. So I used to get lifts, and I used to get lifts in and out, which was awkward. But when I learned to drive, then it transformed the situation. So the car was and remains to this day by far the most important mode of transport. There were more people on bicycles, of course, in the 70s than there would be now. It would be actually very dangerous now to travel by bicycle. It was dangerous enough then as well, of course. But I cycled for a period as well. I was quite a bad cyclist, but I did cycle into town a few times and cycled here and there. But horses and cars were almost gone in the 1970s. Was there anyone in Newtown that had a horse and car? If they did, I can't remember them. There was a few locals, right, who went to the creamery. Actually, there's something now. There was a creamery, of course, in Clorina Village, near Clorina Village, and people went up to the creamery. But the vast bulk of them, even in 1974, were using tractors. I think the transition from horses to motor transport had occurred by 1974. I'd say probably in the 60s and 70s. I'd say it had been. Certainly, I'd say 1960s was the main period when that transformation occurred.
And the farmers, what was their main product that they?
Oh, a lot of them would have been dairy farmers, the cows, but some of them had reared cattle for beef as well. There was very little tillage in the area because, of course, County Limerick was always traditionally pastoral, grazing sort of farm agriculture, and that remains the same to the present. But even those people, though, who weren't involved in farming, I mean, people in Newtown and in Clorina would have had a very strong self-identification as being from the countryside. A lot of them would not have gone into the city very often at all, only when necessary. So even though they were only 7 miles from Limerick City, in many respects they were a world away.
And did you go down to the Shannon often?
Did I go down? No, never actually, never at all. I can't ever remember being down at the River Shannon, and I can't even remember being down there at all in my whole life, which I've learned in more recent years is quite unusual. But then I had no interest in fishing. I don't like water. I don't like boats. I'm afraid of water and everything. So I have actually never been down there. I don't know how commonplace that would be, but I was speaking to a few people in Newtown in recent years when all of the interest developed over the building of the monument in Newtown to the fishermen's or the sailors Haggard and all that, and apparently it's more people than I had expected were unfamiliar with the Shannon. But I certainly I've never been on a boat in the Shannon or anything like that.
And is there anything else that you think of is of importance in the Newtown?
Well, I suppose, these would be things that would be applicable to the whole country. When I came to Newtown first and Clorina first, a lot of people left school early and started work straight away. Now virtually everybody goes on now to finish school, gets the leaving cert, and a great many now go to college. I suppose more women are working now as well. At the time, I didn't know any better, of course, or I didn't notice it, but I suppose it was while it was a society in transition, it was probably old-fashioned by modern-day standards, There weren't that many women working outside the home. My mother didn't. The woman next door, none of I'm just thinking now. No, no. Some of them would have worked before the younger women would have worked before they got married, all right. But then they stopped after getting married, and as I said, everybody went to mass in those days. So I suppose you could say that when I came to Newtown in 1974, it had already undergone big changes. I mean, people sometimes tend to think that, when they were growing up, like it was still an unchanging kind of going back to the time of before the famine. But of course, I mean, I already mentioned the transition from animal power to mechanization on the farm and everything. I mean, for example, even in 1974, most people firstly, everyone had a television. They would have had washing machines. They would have had electric cookers. That transition was well underway in the 70s. Although a lot of people were still using coal fires and open fires and stuff, but I would guess myself that the big changes really began to happen, I'd say, after the Second World War, 50s, 60s and everything, But from the perspective of nowadays, I suppose Newtown in the 70s and 80s was quite old-fashioned. But at the time, of course, people thought it was, they were very conscious of the fact that they were much more advanced than their parents and their grandparents, And but I suppose the big change that has occurred since I first came to Newtown is there's been a large population increase, a lot more people, a lot more houses have been built, larger houses. People have moved into the area too. That's something I actually didn't mention. Up until the 1970s, the same families were living there for generations, as can be verified if you look at the Griffiths valuation of 1851, and you'd be surprised to see so many names are still the same. But since the 1970s, lots of newcomers have moved in, built houses and so on, So I suppose there's been a lot of changes in Newtown in the last 43 years since I first came to live there.
And thank you very much for taking the time to take part in this interview.